In Detroit in the mid-60s, when people look back or people remember when they were there, crime was rising. Then 67 happens. Homicides were ticking upward, and crime became a big issue. And then 74, when Young took office, there were 714 homicides. At least that's what the records show. A lot of people see that as crime that drove people out of Detroit. But you have a bit of a different interpretation of that. Why don't you just talk about that?
Well, I think across the nation, the idea is that cities are emptied out, particularly of their white residents and their more affluent residents, because crime goes out of control in cities across America. And certainly Detroit is seen as ground zero for where that happened. But as a historian, I had the chance to really go back and unpack this, not just decade by decade, but actually year by year, and really ask the question, for example, was crime on the rise prior to the rebellion of 67? And was that the reason that we see an outflux of residents? And in fact, it was not. We see very clearly that certainly under Mayor Kavanaugh, it looks for a moment, particularly after 1965, that crime is ticking up. But there's a whole backstory here, which is number one, the Johnson administration had incentivized counting crime in such a way with its new war on crime measures to incentivize saying that to incentivize showing that you had an uptick in crime. The mayor himself, the head of the police department himself, both went public and said, no, it's actually not that we have a rise in crime. It's that we've counted it differently. We are now counting certain things differently. We are now reporting it differently. And so the irony of ironies is that we begin this intensive sort of policing that will really lead to the rebellion, and we begin these really kind of corrosive practices in cities like Detroit, but in advance of a crime problem. But of course, then we really do get a crime problem because we get a war on drugs, which, like prohibition much earlier in the century, illegal economies are dangerous economies. They're economies of desperation. They are accompanied by violence. They are accompanied by crime. But notably, when urban Detroiters are most suffering the crime problem, white residents have already long gone. They have already long left the city. So it is a bit of a chicken and egg question, and it's an important one as to what happens when.
And you use the term criminalization of urban space, I think.
Right.
Help me understand what that means.
Well, what it means is that essentially in this country, really in response to civil rights rebellions that preceded Detroit, so Philly in 64, Rochester in 64, Harlem in 64, the federal government began articulating the Northern Civil Rights Movement as a crime problem, as a problem of disorder and crime. This is where we get the first clamorings for a war on crime. So it actually begins under Johnson, not Nixon, and it is a moment when we start to see urban space in particular, but particularly black neighborhoods or Latino neighborhoods in urban spaces, as inherently criminalistic. So this is where the police are deployed. By the way, not because this is where the most drugs are, not even close to where people are using more drugs, but this is the perception that that is where the disorder problem is. That is where the crime/disorder problem is. And that process I call the criminalization of urban space, because what it literally meant was that things that had not been illegal before become illegal. Things that had been illegal before but had very slight penalties start to have much higher and higher penalties, much longer time in jail, for example. And pretty soon, cities like Detroit, which Detroit is a mostly black city, but black neighborhoods in other cities, become these sites of intensive criminalization, intensive policing that in turn creates its own social crisis.
Mm-hmm. And given all the problems Detroit faced, well known now, the deindustrialization, white flight, and whatever, is there a way to quantify where mass incarceration fits in as far as how big a problem was that for Detroit and other like northern cities?
Well, I think there's no question we can never underestimate the negative impact of either deindustrialization or white flight. For example, it is deindustrialization that will lead so many impoverished communities to rely upon the drug economy, for example. But as important as both of those things are, we also really have given short shrift to how important the punitive turn, the embrace of mass incarceration was to destroying cities like Detroit. The evidence is quite clear. If you look at any map of the city and you look at where some of the most intensive policing first that will then become incarceration exist, they are the most decimated communities, because it isn't just about not having a job, or it's not just about having the space being all African American. It's about spaces where all the adults have been emptied out, spaces where even when folks return, they are permanently unemployable because of their record, and spaces where without jobs, the drug economy again becomes the primary economy, which has its own trauma. So these are sites of
And the kids, you mentioned the kids
right.
too,
I mean,
of course.
exactly. These are sites of orphaned children, whose parents are in the system. This is the site of newly impoverished children, and frankly, what we see is that so many of these families that are losing parents to incarceration, we have created this never world where essentially you can never get out of it. Often folks will say, well, if they cared about their kids, they wouldn't have done whatever it is to land them in the system. But again, I want to remind everyone that number one, we only know that they're doing these things because that's where the police are, right? So if other communities that are doing these never have this presence of law enforcement, but also because we render them permanently unemployable as a result of a record, it becomes this vicious cycle that, again, devastation is the ultimate result for the city, but also for real individuals, real families in the city.
Mm-hmm. You've kind of touched upon this question, but for much of the time, from certainly the early mid-'70s on, Detroit had a black mayor, a black police chief, a majority black department, and black citizens calling for more police as the
Right.
DPD shrank. Could you help me understand, that phenomenon with what you're saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on the surface, it seems to be contradictory that you could have racialized policing and a war on crime that begins for deeply racialized reasons, and then say at the same time that it ends up destroying a city led by black officials. Because, of course, why would they participate in that kind of process? And this is where we need to understand a couple things. First, that um, the system is so, by the time we get to Mayor Young, by the time we get to his long reign of mayor, most resources that cities can have are in the criminal justice system. You're not going to find resources in the social service sector. You're not going to find them through health, education, and welfare. You're going to find them through the Justice Department. And urban locales, whether they're run by black mayors or white, quickly understand that the way to get support for fiscal management is via essentially crime fighting dollars. That's number one. Number two, police departments are incentivized to become more militaristic, to become more aggressive in their policing, because their arrest figures in turn command more dollars from the federal government. And to be honest, the community then ends up in a position with, yes, high crime rates and violence. And there's no one left to call, frankly, but the police. You might have a drug addicted son, and 20 years previously, you might have had a social service apparatus to get help for that son. By the time we get to the 80s, and we are dealing with addiction crises, such as crack cocaine, the only one who's going to show up when you call is the police. And so the community is very tortured and very torn about how do we deal with this social crisis when the only tools at our disposal, given to us by our mayor, given to us by our president, are really crime fighting tools, not public health tools, not social service tools.
Mm-hmm. Did Jerry Kavanaugh and the police commissioners, whoever chiefs then, did they manipulate the crime data, or is it just they changed the way they were? What's the right way to look at that?
I mean, I think that's certainly up to interpretation. What happens after 1965 is that there are newly available resources for police departments, first for states and for cities, but also quite directly for police departments, that had a need, that could show that they needed these federal dollars to help fight crime. And for fiscally savvy departments and ultimately for fiscally strapped departments, arguing that you needed a SWAT team, arguing that you needed flak jackets, arguing that you needed helicopters is what is going to be heard. And so in Detroit, here's a wrinkle that I'm not sure many citizens have really thought about. Stress becomes one of the most important problems for the Black community in the wake of the rebellion. That's this undercover decoy unit in the police department that Black citizens certainly think of as a vigilante force going out and having far too many suspect fatalities to its credit and so forth. Stress in many respects comes to exist because of this new war on crime. Again, mind you, that's predating a crime problem. This is what allows for funding. This is what allows for those kinds of undercover operations and police operations, helicopter operations. So did they manipulate the data? I don't know. I mean, they certainly became more savvy to understand that if you called something a burglary rather than a larceny, or if you
or a home invasion,
or a home invasion versus a burglary, or and quite frankly, even how you characterize what would be a death of another human being, right? Is it a murder? Is it a manslaughter? Is it intentional? I mean, these nuances are quantifiable. And everyone wised up that what they call a ComStat, you need to have the arrest figures, but you also need to have the crime problem to justify the resources.
Mm-hmm. Does your research show that Detroit had a crime problem, like a literal crime problem in 1972, 71, when stress was first started?
Certainly not anywhere near what the press would have had you believe, and nowhere near what will become the crisis facing Detroit by the 80s. But yes, I mean, crime is ticking upwards as jobs are leaving and as resources are leaving. But we can't, again, underestimate, again, this too is connected to the policies of the criminal justice system. One of the things that happens between 67 and 72 is this intensification of policing of Black spaces in the wake of the rebellion. Remember that during the rebellion, people are rounded up. There's gymnasiums full of people who are arrested. And that pattern, that trend of arresting potential troublemakers doesn't go away. In fact, it's one of the reasons why we get a new mayor. It's one of the reasons we get Roman Gribbs in 1969, because he is running on a very tough law and order program, even though, again, the stats are not showing that Detroit is in trouble with crime, but it is certainly coming apart at the seams in terms of race relations.
Mm-hmm. And this subject a little more than academic with you. You grew up in Detroit.
Right.
Can you reflect on that? Even though you do also say you were kind of late to understand how mass incarceration played itself out in Detroit.
Right. So my first book is about Detroit in the 60s and 70s, and really chronicles the story that will lead to election of Mayor Young. And it's chock full of stories about policing, about arrests, about criminalizing urban space, but I didn't quite see it that way until years later. And one of the reasons that is the case is that I lived in Detroit. I was when you're in it, when you're experiencing historical moments and you're in the center of them, you can't quite have depth perception. You don't quite know what's happening. I graduated from Cass Tech High School in 1981, and I can remember the drug war was all around us. Friends of mine were getting arrested. They were going away. By the way, these were not people who actually did drugs. These were friends of mine who were simply trying to survive on very, very low level, maybe marijuana transactions. But they were all going away. They were all getting arrested. And it's so ironic because back in the time, we took this all very, pull ourselves up by, so-and-so, what an idiot. Why didn't he get his act together and instead go to college? We didn't understand we were in the middle of one of the biggest buildups of criminal justice resources in human history. We didn't understand that we were in the middle of mass incarceration. We didn't understand that we were locking up more Americans than at any other time in our history. So it took me a while as a historian, frankly, to step back from it enough to be able to look at my own city and say, absolutely deindustrialization was a crisis, and so was white flight, but we have missed the elephant in the room. We waged an aggressive war on crime on the most vulnerable population we could have waged it on, and destroyed families, destroyed communities, and frankly emptied out the city of its census population, because those people are now all counted in prisons, in Jackson or Ionia. And then we said, oh my God, look what happened. What happened to Detroit? What did black leaders do to Detroit? It took me a while to have enough depth perception to sort of see this as a much more complicated problem even than I thought it was.